I said, tonight's topic is Mary Powell, Queen of the Hudson. Again, I'm Sarah Wasbert Johnson, Director of Exhibits and Outreach at the museum. And I thought we'd just talk a little bit about the history of the boat and really why she is so famous in Hudson River history. So I thought I'd start with this quote from the New York World on August 16th, 1861. It says, "The Mary Powell is considered by experienced nautical men as the most beautiful and perfect model of any vessel afloat. Captain Anderson, her popular commander, is expected to have his Queen of the Hudson ready for a trip up to Rondout about the 1st of October next." So I love this quote because it establishes that people are already talking about the Mary Powell as the Queen of the Hudson even before she's launched, right? This is in August of 1861. She's not launched until much later, and she certainly doesn't do any runs up to October until the fall. There's another quote from later in that year from the Yonkers Examiner. It says, "The boat is very beautiful, graceful in appearance as a structure, admirably arranged and elegantly finished off internally." And then another one from the World from the following year describes the boat as a perfect floating palace by combining in her all the essential requisites of speed, comfort, and convenience. To give a faithful description of the new Queen of the Hudson, with a view of showing how far Captain A has succeeded in carrying out his plans, would require too much space in our columns. So when I first started working at the Maritime Museum, we had a lot of information about the Mary Powell, and I always wanted to know why she was so famous, right? And it seems to be a combination of her looks, her speed, and how she was run, right? How she was operated. So let's talk a little bit about what happens leading up to the creation of the Mary Powell. Her main inspiration, the main inspiration for the Mary Powell was the steamboat Thomas Powell, which was built in 1846 and was considered one of the fastest steamboats on the Hudson River at that time. It was owned and captained by Captain Absalom Anderson, right? Ran between Manhattan and Poughkeepsie and then later up to Rondout. Interestingly, in 1864, it was used as a dispatch boat during the American Civil War to Union General Benjamin Butler, which is pretty cool. So she did some Civil War service, which was surprisingly not uncommon for a lot of Hudson River steamboats. And then eventually she gets taken out of service later in the 19th century and is scrapped at Port Ewan, basically where Hidden Harbor Yacht Club is right now, in 1881. So this is a barred painting of the Thomas Powell. You can see it's very sleek, very long, very typical of the steamboats at that time. And then this is her later on, possibly under Civil War service. And so why do we end up with the Mary Powell? Well, in 1860, Absalom Anderson, who was the captain of the Thomas Powell, announces that he's going to create a new steamboat. It was built by Michael S. Allison in New Jersey. It was considered to have perfect lines. Her original hull model was like destroyed in a fire. So she could never be replicated, right? That's part of the mystique also. And Captain Anderson was obsessed with speed. He basically said if Allison could build a boat that could beat the Thomas Powell in speed record, he would get like a bonus. And so that was really the emphasis on the design of the boat, was comfort for passengers, but also speed. So she launched in August of 1861. August 16th, she's called Queen. So it was actually after her launching, but before her trial run and speed run, right in October. And then the following spring, she actually starts a regular passenger route to Rondout. After that first season, Captain Anderson is not satisfied and has the Mary Powell hauled out and cut in half and lengthened by 21 feet, right? Which was not impossible in that time period. It did happen with other vessels, but it was not common. So kind of an interesting tidbit. So there aren't very many images that exist of that first version of the boat, but I think I have found some. So this is just a cross section of her design, showing some of her decks with the paddle wheels and the walking beam steam engine. And then this is a barred painting of the Mary Powell. So this is her, I believe, her original configuration. And then we have, excuse me, sorry. There we go. We have another early image of the Powell, which I think also dates to before her lengthening. And another one going the other way, right? Probably loosely based on the barred painting. Another advertising with the graph, a little bit sharper than the last one. Always with those big flags flying, right? So Mary Powell was in many different ways a family boat, right? That's a term that's kind of been used to describe the Mary Powell. And it really is a family boat, not only in that it was, you know, appropriate for and safe for women and families to travel on board, but also because it was owned and operated largely by one family for almost her entire career. So we have Absalom Anderson pictured here. He's our first, the originator and owner of the Mary Powell. Born in Croton-on-Hudson, he is owner and captain of the Thomas Powell, not Thomas Cornell, excuse me, that's a typo. Builder and owner of the Mary Powell, captain of the Mary Powell. And the public had a very high opinion of Captain Anderson. There are a number of newspaper articles that refer to his skill as a captain, how he runs a very safe and efficient vessel. You know, he's kind of the consummate gentleman, always, you know, a gracious word for the ladies, kind to pets and children, you know, that kind of thing. So that, I think, his reputation had a lot to do with the success of the Mary Powell. She did change hands several times over the course of her career. So Captain Absalom Anderson actually does sell her after the Civil War. Not really clear why, probably, you know, Thomas Cornell made him an offer he couldn't refuse, kind of a thing. So Cornell and Daniel Drew, both big transportation guys in the Hudson Valley at that time, have an interest, and then Cornell buys them out. A couple of years later, Captain Ferdinand Frost comes on as captain of the Mary Powell in 1866. It gets purchased by Van Sandvoort and Davidson, also big guys in Hudson Valley transportation history. And then they sell it back at a loss to Anderson in 1872. So Cornell had kind of like zhuzhed up the interior, and then Van Sandvoort and Davidson also like add a bunch of stuff to the interior, which the theory is that slows the boat down, right? So when Anderson takes control again in 1872, he rips out a lot of the frou-frou stuff that they had put in the interiors, and kind of returns her to her former glory in a lot of ways. She does get sold back again to Thomas Cornell in 1882. And then Captain Anderson is captain from 1861 to 65, and then from 72 to 85, which is when he sells again to Cornell. His son Jansen serves as purser under his father, and he's the eldest son in the family and is kind of considered, you know, the heir apparent. There's a reason why he doesn't become captain. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then one of his younger sons, Absalom Elton Anderson, serves as steward and then later takes over as purser for Jansen in 1883. And then in 1886, Elton Anderson becomes captain. He kind of buys out Thomas Cornell. They form the Mary Powell Steamboat Company, and the Mary Powell Steamboat Company, of which Elton Anderson is a shareholder, controls the boat until 1902, when it is sold to the Hudson River Day Line, although Elton Anderson stays on as captain. So the reason why Jansen Anderson never becomes captain is because he dies unexpectedly at age 38 leaving 5 children and a widow. So very keenly missed by both his family and the crew and passengers of the Mary Powell. And so that's kind of why Elting steps up into his big brother's shoes, right? And also his father's shoes. So Absalom Anderson retires in 1885. That's why Thomas Cornell gets involved. That's why Elton Anderson starts the Mary Powell Steamboat Company. He moves to Montecito, California. He had been wintering there for several years and retires out there. His wife and one of his daughters move out there with him. And he lives out there very happily for about 10 years and then has a carriage accident in 1895 and then dies a couple of days later. So he dies in California, but is buried at Montrepose Cemetery in Kingston. So Elton Anderson is the 7th of the 10 Anderson children. In 1881, he marries Fanny V. Elmore. And then in 1883, they have a son who he names Absalom Anderson after his grandfather. But sadly, Absalom Anderson dies in 1890 at just 7 years old, right? We don't really know the cause of death, but he does pass away. He and Fanny don't have any other children. So in terms of the Mary Powell, the Anderson line kind of ends with Elting. They do, however, have a dog, Buster, who becomes kind of the mascot of the boat. And then Anderson was also an automobile enthusiast at a time when automobiles were kind of new. This is him and Fanny, and then here in the corner, kind of blurry because he moved, is Buster. Buster was a brindle bulldog. Here's Buster also doing tricks. Captain Anderson taught him to do all kinds of tricks, like he could pray. He would, if people's stuff went overboard, there were a couple instances where he like leapt off the boat to retrieve a hat, right? And then they had to haul him back in. In his later years, he would take the trolley by himself down to the Rondout to go meet the boat, which I think is a great story. And then this is the Anderson family automobile, driven by chauffeur George and Betts, who may be a relative of one of the steamboat crew, who's also named Betts. So Mary Powell, we've kind of established that she has this queen moniker, right? She becomes very famous in the course of her first really like 25 years, we'll say. But there are challengers to the throne, right, of Queen of the Hudson. In 1881, there is a huge series of newspaper articles speculating about a race between the Mary Powell and the Albany, which was a very large and fairly new steamboat operated by the Hudson River Day Line. There's a great newspaper article. If you want to check it out, it's on our museum blog. They interview the two captains and there's like a lot of bravado. That race never happens. Then Mary Powell gets challenged by like all these like basically early jet boats, right? There are these super fast steam yachts. The first one is the Stiletto, which was built by Herreshoff, who's a very famous boat designer. And they quote unquote raced the Mary Powell and claimed speeds of 23 to 28 miles per hour. Mary Powell supposedly did 26 miles per hour on one of her early runs, and that kind of stays as the record. But Mary Powell wasn't racing. She was just on one of her regular runs, right? And this little like jet boat is trying to race her. Another Herreshoff boat in 1889, the Now Then, races her and claims to have beat the Mary Powell by 8 minutes. But again, Mary Powell is just on her regular like passenger route. She's not necessarily actively racing. And then in 1881, William Randolph Hearst has the boat, commissions the boat, the Vamoose, also designed by John Herreshoff. And they actually loop around the Mary Powell. And so they claim to have beaten the speed record of the Queen of the Hudson, but they're like totally different boats. And once again, it wasn't like an exhibition race. The Mary Powell was just on her regular passenger route. So whether or not she actually was beaten is up for some debate. And it was even in the period, right? There's a lot, people had a lot of loyalty to this boat. And so that's kind of Captain Anderson's opinion is, hey, if you want to race, let's set up an exhibition race and let the Mary Powell get up to speed, and then we'll start the race, right? But then, of course, that never actually happens. So this is the Albany, right? A fairly large boat compared to the Mary Powell, not too much larger, but a little bit bigger. This is the Stiletto. This in the foreground is the Stiletto, right? Way smaller boat. It's, you know, basically the steamboat equivalent of a little jet boat, right? This is the Now Then here in the foreground. Again, very low profile boat designed to like cut through the water, right? And then this is the Vamoose. Again, these steam yachts, right? Just much smaller, designed for speed. And so these are the challengers to the Mary Powell's throne. All right, so there's a number of other reasons why the Mary Powell gets to be so famous. She does have a fair number of famous passengers because she was the primary passenger vessel between New York City and Rondout, with several stops in between. So in 1896, we have both President Ulysses S. Grant and President Schuyler Colfax travel on board. Ulysses S. Grant to travel to West Point, and then Schuyler Colfax actually comes to Rondout. Not really clear why, but he meets with Thomas Cornell and like a bunch of other, you know, kind of businessmen. So maybe it was related to commerce. In 1871, Grand Duke Alexei Alexandrovich of Russia comes for a diplomatic visit, and he is met in New York City, like his sailing vessel is met in New York City by the Mary Powell, and then he boards the Mary Powell for a reception, and then later again takes the Mary Powell to West Point. So that was all over the papers. In 1877, she transports the remains of George Armstrong Custer from the railroad station in Poughkeepsie again to West Point. 1878, Walt Whitman takes the Mary Powell up to Rondout to visit his friend John Burroughs. Oscar Wilde also may have taken the Mary Powell multiple times when he was in New York on a lecture tour in 1882. And then these are just some images. This is the frigate Svetlana, not really clear which one it is. It's either this one or this one. And the Mary Powell is coming. A not very good rendering of the Mary Powell is coming to greet the Grand Duke Alexis. She's also present in a number of famous events. So in 1886, she is the flag boat for the big unveiling of the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor. So there's like a naval parade, and she's kind of the lead vessel for this naval parade, which tells you something about how famous and important she was in the time period in 1886, that the Mary Powell is the boat that's chosen for this honor. Again, she's again the lead in a naval parade for the George Washington inauguration centennial in 1889. That was in New York City. That was a huge deal. President Benjamin Harrison attended that. She's also present for the dedication of Grant's tomb in 1897, although more like just present. She's not necessarily leading any parades. She is one of the many vessels involved in the Hudson Fulton celebration, and takes an excursion as part of that. So you could go on board the boat and be a part of the celebration. So this is Mary Powell leaving the Naval Merchant Parade at the unveiling of the Statue of Liberty. So here's the Statue of Liberty in the back here. And here's Mary Powell, like full to the brim with passengers. She is at a naval parade at Newburgh for the centennial of the end of the Revolutionary War. So she's kind of in the middle again of this big parade. And I always love the art depictions and photographs. She's always in the center, right? There's all these other boats, but Mary Powell's always in the center. So what happened to the Mary Powell, right? What's the end of her career? So Captain Anderson stayed on as her captain from 1886 until 1914, when he died suddenly of apoplexy, right, which is probably a stroke. He had actually just got back from like a moonlight charter the night before, and then the following day he dies. So he worked up until the day he died as captain of the Mary Powell. His wife Fanny dies in 1917. And when she dies, she actually leaves quite a large bequest to the Kingston Hospital for a children's wing. So that's dedicated to the Anderson family. Arthur Warrington takes over as captain. Not super clear when, probably about 1915. He had started as a deckhand and like worked his way up, and specifically took his captain's license test so he could be captain of the Mary Powell. But sadly, he didn't get to be captain for very long for a couple of reasons. One is which the Mary Powell was laid up at the end of the 1917 season. So the Hudson River Day Line took over in 1902, and she continued to be a passenger vessel on the New York City to Rondout route. That whole time, the later years, like 1915, 1916, she was more of an excursion boat. So she wasn't necessarily in regular passenger service, in large part because on holidays, she wasn't big enough for all the passenger traffic. At the end of 1917, right, we joined the United States enters World War I in April of 1917. By the time we get to the end of the season in 1917, there's some coal shortages that are looming as winter comes, right? And so they don't think there's going to be enough demand and enough fuel for her to be in season in 1918. And that is true. We actually have a really bad coal shortage in the winter of 1917, 1918. But also a lot of people are like, it's just an excuse to take her out of service. One of the excuses was that she needed some major restoration, right? The Hudson River Day Line also ended their New York City to Rondout service in 1918. And sadly, Arthur Warrington dies of Spanish influenza in the fall, in October of 1918. So she doesn't have a captain anymore. So in 1919, she is sold. And one of the stipulations by E. Olcott, who was the president of the Hudson River Day Line, was that specifically she not be burned or otherwise used in the making of a motion picture. So that was a thing, right? And if you've seen any Hollywood movies, you know, maybe in like the 1940s, where they have all these World War I planes and they're just destroying them for the film. He did not want that to happen to the Powell. He also did not want her to be put back into service on the Hudson River. So there were some attempts to like sell her to like the Carolinas or somewhere else where she could serve as a passenger vessel, and none of those worked out. So she basically gets sold to be scrapped. Throughout 1919 and 1920, she is left at the Sunflower Dock, which is off of Slatesburg, basically right across the creek from like the Cornell buildings thereabouts. And the people who bought her are trying to find another buyer, right? And it doesn't work out. So in 1920, she's sold again to a scrapper. She's towed up the creek to Connolly, and then she starts to be dismantled. Her engine is sold. Her bell is sold to Bear Mountain for use at the steamboat landing there. And then she also, this is a picture of her bell in use at Indian Point. Before it was a nuclear power plant, it was a Hudson River Day Line park. And so that was like the signal bell, like the steamboat is getting ready to leave. You better get on if you want to leave the park. That bell is now in the museum yard in our gazebo. If you haven't visited it, you should. So between 1921 and 1926, she was actively scrapped. Her whistle went to the steamboat Robert Fulton. A lot of people took souvenirs. Parts of her were used to build houses, and all different little bits of her went all these other places. We have a full list on our online exhibit if anybody wants to check that out. So these are just some pictures kind of in chronological order of her scrapping. So this is from 1920-ish, and you can see her smokestacks have been removed. This is from 1923. You can see like some of her upper decks have been removed. You know, a lot of the superstructure is starting to be removed. This is from 1924, like the whole back half of the boat is gone, her paddle wheels are gone, her engine looks like it's largely gone. This is from 26. And then this is from 1947. So this is one of her beams sticking up out of the mud. And that's pretty much all that's left. They scrap her basically down to the water line. Some of her machinery is left in place for whatever reason, and that's also stuck in the mud. So at low tide, you can sometimes still see the outline of her hull. But when she was being scrapped, people were very upset about it. And really, they acted as if the Mary Powell was a person, right? And there were a number of poems published. I chose this one because it was published in Home Country magazine, which is like a national magazine. I'm just going to read it for everybody, even though you're probably already reading it yourselves. It says, "The old Mary Powell lies in her grave, stripped of all that made her beautiful and great, save the memory and the pleasure she gave to the millions that mourn her sad fate. Mr. Junkman, handle her timbers with care. We shall ne'er see her like afloat again. Lay them aside with a sigh and a prayer, and sing a song of the glory of her reign. Oh, thou wondrous thing of beauty and grace, thou beloved queen of the Hudson without a peer. None can hope to claim thy crown nor place in the hearts of those who hold thy memory dear." The very flowery 1920s poem, but how people really felt about losing this kind of iconic symbol of the Hudson River. So what's the legacy of the Mary Powell? Why are we still talking about the Mary Powell today, right? You see her on walls in bank lobbies and restaurants, and her image is still iconic even now. So from the 1930s to the 1970s, there was a lot of nostalgia about the past, right? This is a time period when automobiles are taking over. You know, life feels like it's kind of speeding up, and there's a lot of nostalgia for days gone by. So there's all kinds of newspaper and magazine articles talking about the history of the Hudson River and Hudson River steamboats, which, you know, are like actively disappearing. And the Mary Powell often features quite prominently in a lot of these articles. In 1952, Kingston had the 300th anniversary of the founding of the city, right? In 1652 is when the Dutch settlement of Wiltwyck was founded. And so there's a lot of interest in the 1950s about steamboats, about the Mary Powell. The 1950s is also when a lot of the Hudson River Day Line steamboats, which was really the last steamboat company on the Hudson River, starts to cease service to a lot of the upper Hudson ports of call. And then pretty much all Hudson River steamboat traffic stops in 1971 with the last voyage of the Alexander Hamilton. That is the end of the Hudson River Day Line, and really the end of the last of those big passenger side wheel steamboats being in active service. In 1972, Donald C. Ringwald published a book about the Mary Powell, which is still like the main primary, secondary source for research and learning about the Mary Powell. We did do some additional research thanks to the magic of digitized newspapers for this exhibit that Don Ringwald did not have access to. But really, he did a ton of really great work recording some of her more intricate history. And then, of course, in 2020, we opened our Mary Powell Queen of the Hudson exhibit at the museum. We have both an in-person exhibit and also an online exhibit because we have unlimited room on the internet. So we had a lot more space to talk about some of her more interesting history. So here she is. One last look. This is the Mary Powell dock. That's Sunflower Dock on the Rondout. That was where her winter berth for most of her career. And that's the end of my talk. So does anybody have any questions? It looks like we had a couple of questions in the chat. Cool, welcome. Philip is joining us from Houston, Texas, but grew up in Peekskill. My German immigrant great-great-grandfather upon arrival traveled up the Hudson River from New York City to Albany in 1864, although unfortunately I do not have the vessel name, but maybe it was the Mary Powell. Yeah, you never know. Okay, Betsy, she sent this just to me, but Betsy has some family history of her mother riding on the Mary Powell, but her mom was born in 1910. Possible. She maybe wouldn't have remembered it. But she was in service until the end of 1917. So it is possible. All right, does anybody else have any other questions or comments? I'll change the settings so you guys can unmute yourself if you want to ask a verbal question. There is a lot more that I did not talk about in this talk. There's a ton more information on our online exhibit, including where a lot of the artifacts ultimately ended up and more about other crew members. So if you're interested in that, you can check that out. I will drop the link in the chat.
How do you put your hand up?
Just waiting. Just talk. Talking.
Sarah?
She'll hear you.
Yeah.
Hi, it's Stephen Blauweiss and Karen.
Hi.
Well, first of all, I have to say that was so excellent.
Thank you.
Everything about it, informative and lively, and we really enjoyed it. And then I forgot my question, but that was the main point anyway. As a
Okay, so,
as a fellow presenter, I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. I'll answer a couple of questions in the chat, and if you think about it, you can chime back in. Okay, Al asks, what percentage of steamboats were able to live a full life? That is a good question. There were not many of them that lasted longer than the Mary Powell. So the Mary Powell was in operation from 1861 until 1917. I think for Hudson River steamboats, you know, the Alexander Hamilton was 1924 to 1971. So that was a pretty good run. Probably the longest serving, and maybe Mark Peckham is on this call, maybe he knows. I think the longest serving was the Norwich, which was built, I think, in the 1830s and did not get scrapped, I think, until the 1910s. If I'm remembering correctly. I mean, a lot of them did live very short lives because of accidents and fires and things like that. So some steamboats only lasted like a couple of years. But I think a fair chunk of them did last, you know, 15 to 20 years. The Mary Powell did, you know, she was in operation for you know, over 50 years, but she was really well cared for. She underwent a lot of upgrades and like repairs, and probably by the time she ceased service in 1917, I don't think probably her hull was at all the same. There's probably no wood from 1861 left in her hull by 1917, right? So a lot of other steamboats were not as well taken care of, and so, you know, a lot of people, it's expensive to maintain wooden boats, and so a lot of people just would run them until they sank, basically. So that's a great question. I hope I answered it for you. Yes, Betsy is asking, is the exhibit still open at the Maritime Museum? It is. We are going to be open Thursday through Sunday throughout the winter, except for between Christmas and New Year's, we're closed. So if you haven't seen it in person and you want to come to the museum, you should definitely come and see it. Joan asks, how many crew did she carry? That's a good question. I don't know the exact number off the top of my head. It was probably around like 25 or 30, depending on who you count as crew. So there's like the engineer crew and the deckhands and the crew in the pilot house. And then there's also the passenger related crew. You know, like there's a purser who's in charge of like selling tickets and money and guards the safe. There's the steward and the stewardess who are kind of like managing to the personal comfort of the employees, the steward for everybody basically, and the stewardess specifically for the female passengers. There's waiters. The deckhands may or may not have also been porters, not super clear. And then in the 19th century, or sorry, the 20th century, there was an orchestra. There's also a barber on board, right? And then the cooking staff to provide meals for everybody. So she had a pretty decent sized crew, but probably, you know, at least half of the crew is specifically for the passengers and not to actually operate the vessel. Oh, Frank, I don't know the answer to that story. Frank says, is it true that Captain Anderson left his wife ashore when she was a few minutes late on one of his trips to New York City? I have not run across that story. It would not surprise me. There is an apocryphal story of Absalom Anderson, who was obsessed with speed, when Absalom Elton Anderson came on board as, I think he was the steward first. You know, he like the deckhands were like carrying his trunk on board, and his dad comes down and is like, that is way too much stuff. That is too heavy. The only people who get trunks are passengers. You take that back, you go home, unpack, and you come back when you can put all of your things in a handkerchief. And then I'll let you back on the boat. So, you know, you treat your kids a little bit differently than your wife. But it would not surprise me. They were real sticklers for, you know, running a tight ship. And I think that's part of also the reason why they get to be so famous. Other steamboats had not very good reputations, particularly when the Mary Powell was being constructed and launched. A lot of her competitor steamboats were kind of like these fly-by-night operations, right? It was a bunch of guys got together and were like, let's have a steamboat company, and bought some old steamboat, and that was their passenger steamboat. And, you know, there was maybe gambling, there might have been some prostitution if it was a night boat, there was some drinking at a time when temperance was very popular among the, you know, middle class. So the Mary Powell probably was not a dry boat. We do have references to her saloon and to alcohol on board, but it was considered, you know, pretty safe for women and children to travel on, particularly in the early days compared to a lot of other steamboats. So John asks how often she needed dry dock. That's a good question. I think she was in dry dock at least 5 times during her career that I know of off the top of my head. It may have been more often than that, but she did get major work done a number of times. There were also a couple of instances where she never had any real major accidents per se, but she did have a couple of instances where like her engine, parts of her engine failed, and so she needed to put into often Newburgh for repair. And then Betsy asks, how long was the trip from New York City to Rondout? That's a good question. I think it was 7 or 8 hours. I want to say I'd have to go back and look at one of her schedules to know for sure. But she was pretty quick. I mean, a lot of her times when they talk about how fast she takes to go from place to place, I think New York City to West Point was 4 hours. And they always say with landings. So she was making stops along the way, and she was making really good time while making these stops. So there's also some stories about like the skill of her pilots, you know, that they could just like come gently into dock, kind of throw the lines on, and then boop right off, you know, very skilled at making landings and coming off the docks. So yeah, I think all of these are kind of why she gets to be so famous. She's got these very conscientious captains and a skilled crew. And she's a beautiful boat. She's a beautiful boat compared to a lot of other Hudson River boats. Great questions on everybody. Does anybody else have any other questions? Steve, did you remember your question?
Yeah, how about, can you talk about like people forget how the luxury which you intimated with the crew that there was doing different things on those ships?
Yeah, so the Mary Powell was probably not the most luxurious Of the boats, Thomas Cornell had kind of a reputation for, you know, these really ornate saloons and all this art and like carved gilded wood everywhere. Mary Powell interiors were a little bit more austere, in part, I think, because both of the Anderson captains were very concerned about speed and they didn't want to weigh everything down. But one of the later updates to the boat, they actually moved the dining room up from the hull of the boat onto the first level, and so you can see out the window while you're eating. So there was a dining room. One of the more famous crew was an African-American woman named Fanny Anthony, who was the stewardess of the Mary Powell from about 1870 to 1912. So she retired just shortly before Captain Anderson died. And so she was in charge of the ladies' cabin. Not super clear what it was, if there were like restroom facilities there also, or if it was just like a quiet place to go to get away from men. You know, maybe if you had a fussy kid or if you had to nurse or you needed to like attend to your appearance, I think that was kind of what the ladies' cabin was. But she got to be very famous, Fanny Anthony. There were a number of newspaper articles about her, including an obituary when she died, which was, and quite a lengthy set of articles and obituaries, especially when you compare her to other very long-serving crew on board the Mary Powell, like some of the pilots and things like that. So yeah, really cool stories. And all of this stuff is on the online exhibit. It's very extensive. I wrote a lot about all the individual crew in particular and the famous passengers on some of these events. But I think, to your point, Stephen, I think it's difficult for us to comprehend as modern people what it was like to be on one of these steamboats. You know, you see a picture of a steamboat and you're like, oh, that's pretty. But then when you think about all the decks, you know, that's a multi-story building, floating building, basically, that's barreling down the Hudson River at, you know, 20 to 25 miles per hour. And for reference, modern cruise ships don't generally, like ocean-going cruise ships generally can't exceed like 30 to 35 miles per hour. So that gives you a sense of how fast those steamboats were, even compared to modern ships, you know, cruise ships, that they were pretty fast for the time period. And to just be out on the river, I mean, a lot of passengers, you know, as kind of casual tourists, either going to New York City or coming up from New York City to the Catskills or wherever, you know, a big part of the journey was just being on the boat and not being in the hot, smelly city that you lived in, being out on the river, being in the fresh air, you know, getting to see beautiful scenery. And it would be a lot cooler, particularly than New York City, right, which is a big heat sink even in the 19th century, and nobody had air conditioning. So okay, Tom asks, what was the season for the Mary Powell and where did the Mary Powell stay in the winter? So most steamboats are going to operate as long as the river is not frozen. So it really depended on the weather. So most of them probably went in the water around April. And then you would come out of the water maybe around November, sometimes as late as December, right? Depending on whether or not the river would freeze. So the profit margins in the passenger steamboat trade are quite narrow. So the longer you could continue to be in operation, the better it was for your bottom line. The record that we have of the Andersons going to California and going to Florida is always in like February, right? So the depths of winter, when for sure you can't do any steamboating, everything is kind of shut down. But also before you have to get ready for the upcoming season. The Mary Powell, her primary dock did move around a little bit, but Sunflower Dock is mostly where she overwintered, right? And it's that dock off of Slatesburg, basically around where the Slatesburg boat launch is today. That's about where the Sunflower Dock was historically. So that was more later in her career. It's not super clear where she wintered over really early on, probably just wherever she docked, right, on the run out. But yeah, they did keep her in the water. I don't know what they did about the ice. I don't know if Mark if you have any insight into that. Nowadays, modern boats, when they're in the water, they have bubblers, right? That keep the water moving around the boat to keep the ice from crushing the hull. I don't know what they did historically, but they kept them in the water, so they had to have done something. I do know also that they did hire like watchmen to go and check on the boats daily. There's a great Captain Benson article that we've transcribed a bunch of his articles and posted them on our history blog. And there's a great Captain Benson article about like the night watchman for a Hudson River Dayline boat. And, you know, E.E. Olcott, the president of the Hudson River Dayline, like comes over to check on them and he freaks out because he thinks it's like some intruder coming. But the president had walked across the ice to get to this boat and check up on it and come visit. So that's a great article if anybody wants to check that out. Oh, Frank says, any guess the price of a ticket from New York City to Kingston? I have a placard showing Dayline tickets from the Point to New York City for $2.50. RT, what's RT? Oh, return trip, I guess. Yeah, that probably makes sense. It really depends also, you know, she's in service for 50 years. So the price changes over the course of her career. I think one of our flyers that we have up in the exhibit, I think says 75 cents, but I'm not sure if that's return trip or not. Definitely the height of the Hudson River Dayline is toward the end of the Powell's career, right? They really start to take off as the big passenger steamboat company, as kind of like their other competition goes out of business in the early 1900s and really until the 1950s. They're in operation. I think the Circle Line buys them in like 56 or 60, sometime around there, and continues to operate the Hamilton as a tourist boat to Bear Mountain until 71. But the Hudson River Dayline they were still using the name, but it was not its own company much after the 1950s. So I don't know, Frank. It changes. Any other questions? You guys are coming up with such great questions. I hope I'm answering them adequately. Anybody else? No? Well, if you're like me and you think of something the minute the meeting is over, you can always email me and I will do my best to respond. My email I'm dropping in the chat is swasberg@hrmm.org. So yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for joining me tonight and for having such great questions about the Mary Powell. I hope you all come and see the exhibit. Like I said, the museum is going to be open Thursday through Sunday, 11 to 5 throughout the winter. So if you're looking for something to do and it's kind of a yucky day, you should definitely come and visit. Oh, Tom has one more question. Yes, Tom, go ahead. Better type fast. But yeah, we've got a lot of really awesome artifacts from the Mary Powell, including her pilot wheel, which is on loan from Senate House State Historic Site. Her steam whistle that was on the Robert Fulton is also now on display. Oh, Tom asks, did trains race the Mary Powell similar to ice boats? That is a good question. I think with ice boats, it was more ice boats racing the trains than the other way around. I think the trains were the Mary Powell in that instance, and the ice boats were the Arishoff boats, right? I have not run across any references to trains racing steamboats, probably because the trains would win, right? You know, steamboats, their top speed in this time period is, you know, like I said, I think the Mary Powell was clocked at going at 26 miles per hour. Trains can go like 70 miles per hour in this time period. The reason why ice boats are racing the trains is because ice boats can go up to 100 miles per hour, depending on the conditions, right? If the conditions are perfect. So my favorite line is that ice boats were once the fastest vehicles on Earth, right? Because they're faster than a train. Steamboats were not faster than trains. Trains were quite a bit faster. But definitely, you know, people like to talk about how, oh, the steamboat replaced sailboats and trains replaced the steamboat, and cars replaced trains, but it's really much more complicated than that. And most of these forms of transportation coexisted. Like we had cargo, sail freight, basically cargo sailing vessels on the Hudson River until the 1920s. And we have passenger steamboats until the 1970s, right? Which is after the Eisenhower interstate highway system starts to get built. So there is some influence, definitely the passenger steamboats, people who are able to take their own air-conditioned vehicles and go wherever they want is a big competition for passenger steamboats in the Hudson Valley. Air conditioning is a big form of competition. People are no longer leaving the city in the summertime necessarily because air conditioning is available. And also just the expense of operating them. Those are kind of all the factors that combine in the decline of steamboats. So